The gunshot echoed through the valley as Quentin Nicholson rode hard across the New Mexico territory, blood seeping through the tear in his prized leather duster, the same coat that had shielded him from dust storms, desert sun, and more than one bullet since his father had placed it on his shoulders 10 years ago. The year was 1875, and the West was still untamed, a place where a man's reputation and the speed of his draw often meant the difference between life and death. At 32, Quentin had earned a name for himself not as an outlaw, but as a man who could be trusted to deliver mail, valuables, and occasionally people safely across territories where law was more suggestion than rule. Wind whipped at his face as he pushed his stallion, Midnight, harder. The blood on his shoulder had dried, but the wound beneath still burned with each gallop. 3 riders had ambushed him near Rattlesnake Pass, hoping to steal the package he carried for a banker in Santa Fe. 2 had turned back when Quentin's aim proved better than theirs. The 3rd wouldn't be riding anywhere ever again. "Easy boy," Quentin murmured as Midnight crested the hill overlooking Copper Creek. The small settlement glowed with lantern light against the deepening twilight. Almost there. Copper Creek had sprung up 5 years prior when a minor silver vein was discovered nearby. The silver hadn't lasted, but the town had, serving as a waypoint for cattle drives and stagecoaches. Quentin had passed through a dozen times but never lingered. He preferred the open country to town walls and the stars to a roof. His vision blurred slightly as he rode down the main street. Loss of blood, he figured, but nothing that would kill him. He'd suffered worse. He pulled Midnight to a stop outside the town's only hotel, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sign that swayed in the evening breeze. Inside, the hotel owner, a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache, looked up from his ledger. "Need a room," Quentin said, placing coins on the counter. "And information on where I might find a doctor." "Doc Miller died last spring," the man replied, eyeing the blood on Quentin's coat. "Influenza. Got his daughter taking over some of his duties, though she ain't officially trained. She's been helping folks well enough. Name's Penelope Vance. Lives at the edge of town, white house with blue shutters." Quentin nodded, took the key, and led Midnight to the livery before making his way to the white house with blue shutters. His steps were unsteady by the time he knocked on the door, and he leaned heavily against the frame. The door opened to reveal a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot, wisps escaping to frame a face marked by intelligence and wariness. Her green eyes widened at the sight of him. "Miss Vance," he managed. "Yes," she answered, her gaze immediately finding the tear and bloodstain on his coat. "You're hurt." "Just need it stitched," Quentin said. "I can pay." She stepped back, allowing him entry. "I'm not concerned about payment right now. Come in and sit down before you fall down, Mr. Nicholson, Quentin Nicholson." The interior of the house was modest but clean, with shelves of books and glass bottles of medicines lining the walls. A pot of something simmered on the stove, filling the air with the scent of herbs. "Take off your coat, Mr. Nicholson," she instructed, moving to wash her hands in a basin. Quentin hesitated. The duster had been his constant companion, a gift from his father before the old man succumbed to consumption. In 10 years, he'd never let another soul handle it. "I need to see the wound," she prompted, turning back to him. "The wound, yes," he agreed, unbuttoning his shirt instead, "but the coat stays on." Something in his tone must have communicated the finality of his decision. She raised an eyebrow but approached to examine his shoulder where he'd pulled the shirt aside while keeping the coat on. "Bullet grazed you," she assessed, probing gently. "Not too deep, but it needs cleaning and stitching. This would be easier if the coat stays on," he repeated. She sighed. "Very well, I'll work around it. Hold still." As she cleaned the wound with whiskey, Quentin gritted his teeth against the burn. She worked efficiently, her hands steady and gentle. "You're good at this," he observed. "I learned from my father," she replied, threading a needle. "He was disappointed not to have a son to follow in his footsteps, so he taught me instead. Said my hands were steadier than any man's he'd ever seen. Smart man." "He was," she agreed, a shadow of grief crossing her features. "This will hurt." He didn't flinch as the needle pierced his skin. They sat in silence as she worked, the only sounds the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the distant piano from the saloon down the street. "There," she said finally, tying off the thread. "Keep it clean. Change the bandage daily and let it rest no shooting or fistfights for at least a week. Quentin nearly smiled at that. Yes, madam. Your coat is torn, she observed, looking at the ragged hole where the bullet had passed through the leather. It'll do, he said, standing and reaching for his hat. I could mend it for you, she offered, while you're in town recovering. No need, he replied curtly, placing coins on her table. Thank you for the doctoring, Miss Vance. She followed him to the door. If the wound reddens or feels hot to the touch, come back immediately. He nodded once and stepped into the night, feeling her eyes on his back as he walked away. The next morning brought clear skies and a throbbing reminder of yesterday's encounter. Quentin rose early despite his injury, checking on midnight before walking to the telegraph office to send word to Santa Fe that the delivery would be delayed. As he walked back toward the hotel, he noticed Penelope Vance emerging from the general store, a basket over one arm. She spotted him too, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. Mr. Nicholson, she called, crossing the street to meet him. How is your shoulder this morning? Still attached, he replied. A smile touched her lips. High praise indeed. May I check it later today? Infections can set in quickly. Before he could answer, commotion erupted from the saloon. A man staggered out, shouting obscenities, followed by the barkeeper brandishing a club. I said get out, Wheeler, the barkeeper yelled. You're drunk and it's not even noon. Wheeler, a scraggly man with a week's growth of beard, drew his pistol. Nobody tells me when I've had enough. Instinctively, Quentin stepped in front of Penelope as the crowd on the street scattered. His hand moved to his own weapon, but before he could draw, Wheeler fired wildly. The bullet struck the wooden post beside them, sending splinters flying. In one fluid motion, Quentin drew and fired. His bullet found Wheeler's gun hand, sending the man's weapon clattering to the dirt as he howled in pain. The marshal appeared, drawn by the gunfire, and quickly took control of the situation. Wheeler was dragged off to the jail, cursing and bleeding. You're bleeding again, Penelope observed, looking at Quentin's shoulder where a fresh stain was spreading on his coat. He cursed under his breath. The sudden movement had torn his stitches. Come on, she said, her tone brooking no argument. I need to fix that. This time they went to his hotel room where she had more space to work. Once again she asked him to remove his coat, and once again he refused. Mr. Nicholson, you are being unreasonably stubborn, she said, frustration evident in her voice. That coat is in the way. Then work around it, he insisted. She narrowed her eyes. Is there something special about this coat, or are you just being difficult because it's in your nature? The question caught him off guard. People rarely asked him personal questions, and he rarely offered information. But something about her directness made him answer. It was my father's, he said simply, understanding dawned in her eyes. I see. She paused, then added, Still, it would be easier to treat you properly without it. I promise I would be careful with it. No one touches this coat, he said, his voice quiet but firm. She sighed but nodded, proceeding to work around the leather as best she could, redoing the stitches with careful precision. You're handy with a gun, she commented as she worked. So was Wheeler when he's sober, Quentin replied. He'll be looking for payback when the marshal lets him out. Then perhaps you should move on once you're healed, she suggested, though something in her voice hinted she didn't entirely mean it. I've got business in Santa Fe, he confirmed. Just waiting till I can ride without tearing these stitches again. 3 days minimum, she instructed, finishing her work. And this time please try not to engage in any heroics. His lips twitched. I'll do my best, Doc. The hint of a smile he'd used surprised them both. Penelope gathered her supplies, her cheeks slightly flushed. Thank you, he said before she could leave, for fixing me up, twice. It's what I do, she replied, but her smile suggested his thanks meant something to her. Over the next few days, Quentin found himself lingering in Copper Creek. He told himself it was to fully heal, but each morning he found reasons to walk past the White House with blue shutters, and each afternoon Penelope found reasons to check his wound. On the 4th day, he helped her carry supplies when he encountered her struggling with a heavy crate from the general store. On the 5th, he fixed her gait, which had been hanging crooked. By the 6th day, the people of Copper Creek had grown used to seeing the quiet courier and the doctor's daughter together, and whispers started about how Quentin Nicholson seemed to be putting down roots. But the tear in his coat remained, a jagged reminder of the bullet that had nearly taken his life. Each time Penelope saw it, she offered to mend it. Each time he refused. On the seventh day, news arrived that changed everything. A rider came thundering into town, his horse lathered and panting. "Wheeler's gang is coming," he shouted to anyone who would listen. 8 men, maybe more. They're looking for the man who shot Wheeler. The marshal found Quentin at the livery, preparing midnight for a departure he'd been postponing for days. "Nicholson," the marshal said, "this is your mess. Wheeler's got friends from his outlaw days coming to settle the score." Quentin tightened Midnight's cinch. "I'll ride out, draw them away from town." "Won't work," the marshal shook his head. "They'll burn Copper Creek to the ground looking for you, and they'll hurt anyone who helped you, including the doctor's girl." The mention of Penelope made Quentin's blood run cold. He had faced down many dangers in his life, but the thought of harm coming to her because of him was unbearable. "When are they coming?" he asked. "Tomorrow, maybe the next day," the marshal replied. "Word is they're gathering men," Quentin nodded. "Then we have time to prepare." For the first time in years, Quentin found himself organizing a defense rather than riding away from trouble. He went from house to house, speaking with the men of Copper Creek, many of whom had served in the war between the states and knew how to handle firearms. By evening, Copper Creek was a town transformed. Barricades had been erected at strategic points, and every able-bodied man was armed and positioned. Women and children were gathered in the sturdy stone church at the center of town. Penelope refused to join them. "I'll be needed when there are injuries," she said firmly when Quentin found her organizing medical supplies in her home. "Penelope," he said the first time he'd used her given name, "it's not safe." "Life isn't safe, Quentin," she countered, "but we still have to live it." Her courage both frustrated and moved him. He reached for her hand, surprising them both. "Stay at the rear lines, at least," he requested. "Please." Something in his eyes must have conveyed his concern because she nodded. "I'll set up in the back room of the general store. It's brick, so it's safer than most buildings." "Thank you," he said, relief evident in his voice. He hesitated, then added, "When this is over, I'd like to talk to you about something." Curiosity flickered across her face. "What about?" "About staying," he said simply, then turned to go before she could respond. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of beautiful day that seemed at odds with the violence that was approaching. Quentin stood on the roof of the hotel, scanning the horizon through a spyglass. They came at noon, just as the church bell struck 12. 10 riders, hard-faced men with rifles across their saddles and revolvers on their hips. Wheeler rode at their head, his hand bandaged, his face twisted with the desire for revenge. "Nicholson." Wheeler shouted as they halted at the edge of town. "Come on out and face me like a man, or we start shooting up this town," Quentin signaled to the men hidden around the town. "Hold steady," he called softly. "Wait for my shot." He stood up, making himself visible on the rooftop. "Wheeler." He called back. "Turn around and ride out. This doesn't have to end badly." Wheeler spat on the ground. "You shot me, you son of a bitch. Nobody does that to John Wheeler in lives." "You were drunk and firing wildly," Quentin replied calmly. "I stopped you from killing innocent people." "Last chance, Nicholson." Wheeler raised his rifle. "Come down or we start shooting." Quentin had faced men like Wheeler before, men who mistook cruelty for strength and vengeance for justice. He knew there would be no reasoning with him. "I'm not coming down," he answered, raising his rifle. "And you're not coming in." Wheeler fired, the bullet striking the roof near Quentin's feet. That was all the signal the defenders of Copper Creek needed. Gunfire erupted from windows, rooftops, and barricades. 2 of Wheeler's men fell immediately, taken by surprise by the organized resistance. The others scattered, seeking cover and returning fire. The battle for Copper Creek had begun for an hour. Gunfire echoed through the streets as Wheeler's gang attempted to penetrate the town's defenses. Quentin moved from position to position, directing the defense and taking shots when clean ones presented themselves. 3 of the townspeople were wounded in the initial exchange, and Quentin helped carry them to Penelope's makeshift infirmary. She worked tirelessly, her hands steady as she extracted bullets and stitched wounds. "How many are left?" she asked as Quentin brought in the 3rd wounded man. 5, including Wheeler," he replied. "They've pulled back to regroup. It won't be long before they try again." She looked up from her work, concern etched on her face. "Be careful, Quentin," he nodded, touched by her worry. "You too." The second assault came as the sun began its descent. This time, Wheeler's men charged from multiple directions, attempting to overwhelm the town's defenses through sheer aggression. Quentin found himself in the thick of the fighting, exchanging gunfire with a bearded outlaw who had taken position behind a water trough. A bullet grazed his arm, adding another tear to his already damaged coat, but he barely noticed as he continued to fire. The tide turned when the marshal managed to flank two of the attackers, catching them in crossfire. Another fell to a shopkeeper's lucky shot. Suddenly, only Wheeler and one companion remained. "It's over, Wheeler," the marshal shouted. "Drop your weapons." Instead of surrendering, Wheeler's companion made a desperate dash for his horse. Multiple shots rang out and he crumpled to the dust. Wheeler, now alone, snarled like a cornered wolf. He broke from his cover, running not toward escape, but toward the general store toward Penelope. Quentin saw his intention and moved without thinking, racing down the street as Wheeler burst through the store's front door. He heard Penelope scream inside, and fear like he'd never known gripped his heart. He crashed through the door to find Wheeler holding Penelope at gunpoint, his arm around her neck, his revolver at her temple. "Drop it, Nicholson," Wheeler growled, "or she dies right now." Quentin slowly lowered his weapon to the floor, his eyes never leaving Penelope's. Despite her fear, he saw determination there and something else: trust. "Let her go, Wheeler," Quentin said evenly. "It's me you want." "Damn right it is," Wheeler spat, "but now I'm thinking I'll take her too. Insurance for my ride out of here." "That's not happening," Quentin said, his voice deadly calm. "You won't make it 10 miles with every man in this town hunting you." Wheeler's grip tightened on Penelope, making her wince. "Then maybe I'll just kill you both right here." What happened next occurred so quickly that later, witnesses would disagree on the sequence of events. Penelope suddenly drove her elbow back into Wheeler's stomach with unexpected force. As he gasped, his grip loosened, and she twisted away. Quentin lunged forward as Wheeler raised his gun. The outlaw fired, the bullet tearing through Quentin's coat at the shoulder, missing flesh but shredding leather. Quentin's fist connected with Wheeler's jaw, sending him staggering backward. Wheeler recovered quickly, aiming again, but Quentin was faster. His second punch knocked Wheeler's gun away, and his third sent the man crashing into a display of canned goods. Wheeler scrambled for his fallen weapon, but found himself looking down the barrel of the marshal's shotgun as he entered through the back door. "It's over, Wheeler," the marshal said firmly. "You're going to hang for this." As Wheeler was led away in chains, the townspeople emerged from their positions, assessing damage and tending to the wounded. 5 of Wheeler's men lay dead in the street. The rest, including Wheeler himself, were bound for the territorial prison or worse. Quentin found Penelope sitting on a crate behind the store, her hands trembling slightly as the danger passed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling before her. She shook her head. "No, but you are." She pointed to his coat, where the new bullet hole gaped alongside the original tear. "Your poor coat is taking quite a beating." Despite everything, he found himself smiling. "It's seen worse." She reached out hesitantly, her fingers hovering near the tattered leather. "Will you let me fix it now?" "After all we've been through," Quentin looked at his coat, at the tears that marked his recent battles, and then at Penelope, brave, stubborn, beautiful Penelope. Something shifted inside him. "Yes," he said softly, "I think it's time." That evening, as the town celebrated their victory with music and drinks at the saloon, Quentin sat in Penelope's kitchen, watching as she carefully stitched the tears in his beloved coat. He felt strangely vulnerable without it, as if he had removed armor rather than just a garment. "This is fine leather," she commented as she worked. "Your father had good taste." "He was a good man," Quentin replied. "Taught me everything important: how to ride, shoot, and recognize what matters in life." "And what matters?" she asked, not looking up from her stitching. Quentin watched her hands move deftly, repairing what had been broken with care and precision. "Honor, truth," he paused, "finding a place in people worth staying for." Her hands stilled for a moment and she looked up at him. "And have you found that?" "I think I might have," he answered honestly. She resumed her work, but a smile played at her lips. "Tell me about your father," she requested, "the man who owned this coat before you." So he did. As she mended his coat, Quentin shared stories he hadn't told anyone in years about his father's ranch in Texas, about learning to break horses, About the night his father had placed the coat on his shoulders and told him to find his own path. He died the next spring, Quentin concluded. Consumption took him quick. I've been wearing his coat ever since, carrying a piece of him with me wherever I go. Penelope tied off the last stitch and smoothed the leather with her palm. It's ready, she said, holding it up for his inspection. The repairs were nearly invisible, the stitching so fine it blended with the leather's natural creases. Quentin stood and allowed her to help him into the coat. It settled on his shoulders, familiar yet somehow different. Thank you, he said, facing her. You're welcome. She smiled up at him. It suits you. Outside, the sounds of celebration continued, but in the kitchen's warm light, a different kind of celebration was beginning, one of newfound trust, of barriers lowered, of possibilities opening. Penelope, Quentin said, taking her hand, I meant what I said earlier about staying. If you'd be agreeable, I'd like to make Copper Creek my home. Her eyes searched his. What about your courier business, your life on the trail? There's a need for reliable mail service between here and Santa Fe, he replied. I could establish a proper route, hire riders. Build something permanent. She stepped closer, her hand still in his. And is that all that's keeping you here? Business opportunity? He shook his head slowly. No, not even close. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a question asked and answered in the same breath. Then it deepened, becoming a promise of devotion, of partnership, of a future neither had dared imagine before today. When they finally parted, Penelope rested her head against his chest, her hand over his heart, protected by the coat she had mended. Your father would be proud, she whispered. You found your path. Quentin held her close, feeling for the first time in years that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 1 year later, Quentin stood on the porch of the White House with blue shutters, now his and Penelope's home, watching as she tended the garden they had planted together. His courier service was thriving, with 3 young riders carrying mail and packages throughout the territory. The people of Copper Creek had embraced him as one of their own, and he had found the belonging he hadn't known he was seeking. Penelope looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun, and smiled at him. She wore a simple gold band on her finger, matching the one on his hand. They had married in the spring, with the entire town in attendance. What are you thinking about, standing there so serious? She called to him. He descended the steps to join her, his father's coat now showing signs of careful mending, in several places hanging on a peg inside. He no longer needed to wear it constantly. It had become a cherished keepsake rather than a shield. I was thinking, he said, taking her hand, that some wounds need more than stitching to heal properly. She nodded, understanding. And some tears lead to stronger bonds when they're mended right. As the sun set over Copper Creek, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Quentin Nicholson, once a solitary rider, now a husband, businessman, and respected town member, knew with absolute certainty that he had found his home, not in a place, but in the heart of a woman brave enough to mend what was broken, patient enough to wait for trust, and loving enough to see the man beneath the coat.